In terms of an agenda, what I want to cover today, in general, I want to cover Start Centers. And for those of you guys that are familiar with our webcast, you might have actually attended a different webcast on Start Centers provided by OnTrax just a couple of months ago. This one, you can consider it as kind of an addendum to that. There was a couple of topics that weren't covered in that one that I'm going to cover in this one, mostly how you would modify result sets on a Start Center, as well as how you can create KPI templates. Plus, you can almost consider this one a little bit of a more basic approach, where I'm actually going to show you, how you can modify these Start Centers, how you can create queries. If you're looking for more of a what are some of the best practices and when you're creating Start Centers, some of the more advanced configurations and system properties that you can set on your Start Centers, and how you can craft queries, I recommend that you take a look at that webcast, which is also available on our website. So consider these to work hand in hand. So in terms of what I'll cover today, I really just want to give you guys an overview of what a Maximo Start Center is, what it's intended to do. So I'll talk about the different portlets that you can potentially put on a Start Center and how to use them. From there, I'm going to talk about actually associating saved queries to those result set portlets, they're called, so how you can actually put some data and save queries onto your Start Centers. And I'm also going to talk about how we would go about modifying those result sets, how we can add some color coding perhaps, how we can add columns from related objects, that type of configuration. From there, we're going to talk about creating KPIs and associating those KPIs, key performance indicators, to your Start Center, and we'll round everything off with creating KPI templates, which is one of the new features, or new-ish features now, in Maximo 7.6. So in terms of a Maximo Start Center overview, for those of us that maybe aren't as familiar with what a Maximo Start Center is, what it's intended to be is, I consider it a one-stop shop for everything that you may need to do in Maximo. You can, if you think about an organization that's got a number of users in the system, all those users likely have a different role. Somebody who perhaps uses the system for purchasing would have purchasers, and then you might have people in the system who create work orders, or planners who plan those work orders, or perhaps schedulers, or even inventory personnel who are logging on and issuing out parts to those work orders, and maybe creating purchase requisitions to replenish their inventory. All those different roles do very different things in Maximo, and they need to see very different sets of data. The Start Center is a mechanism that allows you, when you log on to Maximo, you see all of the data that's relevant to somebody in your role. When you're designing these Start Centers, I like to tell people that what you want to include in them is a set of data that is most important to that user. So perhaps somebody who is a planner, somebody who needs to associate tools and materials and labor onto a work order, when they log onto the system, they'll likely want to see new work orders that have been entered into the system, that type of data, whereas somebody who maybe is a scheduler, if you have different schedulers and planners in their different roles, somebody who's a scheduler might want to see work orders that have been planned, and then they can actually schedule those planned work orders. So you can start to see that you form these roles in your organization, and these roles will want to see something completely different. So that's done using what's called the Start Center. Now, a Start Center has a set of portlets, they're called, which form the different types of data, we'll call it, that you can actually see on your Start Center. One of them, the very first one, and probably the most simple one, so we'll start there, is the Favorite Applications portlet. And the Favorite Applications portlet looks like this. What I'm actually showing you, let me go back to my Start Center here. It looks like this portlet that I'm circling here. And what I'm actually going to do for the duration of this demo is I'm going to collapse the left-hand menu I think Maximo 7.6 isn't new to anybody, but maybe for those of you guys that it is, the go-to menu is now displayed on the left-hand side, and we can collapse it as needed. So I'm going to collapse that just to actually give us a better view of our Start Center. So going back to our quick insert, this portlet that I'm circling here, as well as this portlet, are favorite applications rather. So that's basically a section that allows you a visibility into the applications that you most normally use. You'll actually notice in this case that I'm logged in as the Max admin user. This is the administrative user in Maximo. So I've got applications that are relevant to somebody who might be an administrator. For example, the users and security groups applications, which allow me to create and view new users, as well as some of the workflow-related applications, such as the workflow designer roles, actions, and so forth, that allow me to make workflows within Maximo. The next portlet that you can create in Maximo, and I'm going to talk about in just a second about how you add these, is the quick inserts, and that's actually very similar to the favorite applications. Portlets, it's really just a listing of applications, but in the sense that in the favorite applications portlets, where they're really just a list of apps, and let's click on the users app, for example. When I click into this, it takes me to the users application. As you can see at the top, we're in the users app, and now I can filter by number of users and pull out any users that I'm looking for, whereas a quick insert portlet is very similar, except when I click the new user button, it actually takes me to the users app again and creates a user record for me. So very similar portlets. One actually takes you to the application, whereas the other one takes you to the application and creates a new record. Moving down the list of portlets that you can put on your Start Center to round out this view that you want to show your users, the next one I want to talk about is just the bulletin board. And the bulletin board is where you would display and broadcast messages perhaps out to your entire user base. Some companies like to put out outages, for example, for those of you guys that roll out configuration changes and enhancements. Perhaps you're doing this on a schedule. What I've seen in a lot of cases is that you'll actually, companies will put out a bulletin board that says, tonight at 8 p.m., Maximo is going down, and then a list of perhaps configuration changes. Those are some of the things that you might want to broadcast out to your user base, and that's done using the bulletin board. The next one that we'll talk about is your inbox assignments portlet. The inbox assignments portlet, for those of you guys that have workflow mechanisms in Maximo, if you're not familiar with workflow, feel free to look at our website. We've presented other webcasts on it before. You should be able to pull those up. But they're just, what a workflow is a mechanism to be able to route a record from one person to another in Maximo, and that mechanism also allows you to make changes to the record in flight, if you will. So that's often used for perhaps PO or work order approval or PR approval, and you could potentially create a process that guides a user and a record throughout that approval process. And if I'm, for example, a supervisor that needs to approve a PR, PO, or work order, or whatever it happens to be, that approval would show up in my inbox assignments. Again, we have other webcasts on that, so if you'd like to see more information about how to customize your inbox assignments, please see some of those. The ones that I want to mostly cover today, though, are really these result sets and KPI portlets. So if we look down here, there's a KPI graph in Maximo. In my Start Center here, and a KPI, key performance indicator in Maximo, is meant to be, it's a calculated number, and it's supposed to be something that allows you as the user who sees this to make a decision based on that number. So when you're thinking about the types of KPIs that you might create, really think about providing useful information that allows somebody who sees that information to make a decision based on that. So you can imagine we've got all this data stored in Maximo. It's stored across a number of different tables. So you've got all this data at your fingertips. The KPI graph is now what allows you to make a calculation based on that data and display it to the user. And anytime that you're calculating a number, so in this case I've got one for the current number of user sessions that are logged in at the time. There's just one. It's actually just me. And what a KPI allows you to do is to apply bands of a target of 550, where you would start to caution, and then where you would start to alert if your KPI calculated number starts to reach any of these values. And the very last one, I'm going to go back more into actually creating one of these. So throughout this webcast, we'll actually work through an example of how you create these. And the very last result set that I want to talk about today is a result set portlet. So that is actually how you would display data and records in the system to a user through their Start Center. In this case, I've got one. It's the currently logged in users result set, and this is just showing me as an administrator, as somebody who cares about system load and how many users perhaps are logged in the system, the types of users that are logged in the system. This result set here, it just tells me how many users are logged in, and that is actually a saved query, which we're going to talk about how to change later on in this webcast. So that's in essence the overview of what you can do in your Start Center. So with the combination of all these different portlets, your quick inserts, your favorite applications, bulletin board, inbox assignments, KPIs, and KPI and result sets, that's how you can create the user experience and essentially that one-stop shop for users who are logging in. Actually, one last one here. The report list is one that it's less used. From my experience, I don't see this often, but it's actually one of the more useful portlets as well, where you can create a list of reports that a user can run right from the Start Center. So in this case, again, as an administrator, I might care about the user types in the system as well as how many users are logged in. So in terms of actually modifying your Start Centers, there are, I'll call it, two different ways of modifying your Start Center. There is modifying of just your own personal Start Center. So that would be a user who logs on and modifies their own individual Start Center, what they see. And you can add new portlets if you'd like. You can modify existing portlets. Or the second way of doing this is actually to modify a Start Center template. And a Start Center template is something that is associated to a security group. You can, as an administrative user who's got access to it, would be able to modify that template, and then that template, then when an end user updates their Start Center, that user would actually inherit the changes that you as an administrator might have made to that Start Center template. You'll notice up at the top here, these are the buttons in which we would actually do this. So if for those of you that have access, I think many of you might actually see this Change Content Layout button. What this does is it actually allows me to make changes to my specific Start Center that I'm looking at. Keep in mind, I'm only making changes to my personal Start Center in this case and not to the template. So by clicking this button, it takes me to the layout and configuration screen, and this is now where I can choose in the left column, what do I see, as well as in the right column, what do I see. And you can tell here we've got the quick inserts, our favorite application portlets, and so on, whereas in the right wider column, we've got a bulletin board, inbox assignments, and our KPIs. You can actually change the layout of your Start Center if you wished. The default Maximo Start Center is very much wider on the right and narrow on the left, as you can see here. But if you wanted to change it such that it was equal, or if you wanted it wider on the left, narrower on the right, you can certainly do so by changing the layout. setting in your layout and configuration window. Going down the list here, you'll also notice there's display settings for your Start Centers. This would be if you happen to be a user who's got access to more than one Start Center. In this case, the Max admin user that I'm logged in as does have access to more than one Start Center. We've got 3 different Start Centers, and this is where we can actually set what Start Centers we want to display and which one is our default. So in the case right now that I've got 3 Start Centers, I might want to make one of these my default rather than another. You will also notice there is this other column, this is mobile checkbox on your Start Centers, and that is mobile checkbox defines whether a specific Start Center is available for mobile logins. So let me actually scroll over and show you this Every Place Start Center. It's a Start Center which, if you'll notice the layout of narrow, wide, and equal, and wide, narrow, those are gone. Actually, everything is displayed essentially in this one narrow view. And that's to allow for lower resolution mobile devices to be more readable and more user-friendly for this Start Center. And when we set this Start Center up, that is mobile checkbox that I showed you earlier is going to then make this our default mobile Start Center. Now, let me show you what that actually looks like in flight. So if I log out of Maximo and I want to test this, there's a mobile login which I can now click on, and this will just demonstrate what the Every Place login in Maximo looks like, and I can log in as this user Wilson, and when I now log into Maximo, this is what I would see on my mobile device. You know, it would render slightly differently, of course. You know, it would be much narrower. It would likely be, you know, something that's about that narrow on your mobile device. But you can get a sense of this is what a mobile Start Center looks like. Now let me go back into Maximo as my Max admin user that I was just testing on, and actually and round out the buttons at the top and what we can do with our Start Centers. If you recall, we were talking about how any of these changes that I make on my Start Center, I'm only making against my logged in user, in this case Max admin. If I wanted to modify a template, I would do so using the Modify Existing Templates button. And this is going to pop up a dialog that then is going to show me all of the different templates that are available for me to modify. You'll actually notice if I click on the Administration template, now this is going to bring up a new tab that shows me what the Administration Start Center template looks like. It's actually very similar to that Start Center that I just showed you a second ago, but if you notice on mine, this is my personal one, I've actually added a few ones. So for the purpose of this demo, I think all we need to know is that you have the ability to modify Start Center templates, and once you've made changes to your template, you can save your changes using the Save Template button. In this case, I'm just going to cancel out. We won't make any changes. And once you've made those changes, once your end users log on the top right, you can actually get them to click the Update Start Center button, which will take that template that you've edited, and that'll make their Start Center, the Start Center represent that template, if you will. Be aware that any time that you do this, any Start Center changes that they have made are actually going to be overwritten. So please be aware of that. Another couple of tidbits on your Start Centers. Start Centers and what you can do on a Start Center is controlled using Maximo security groups. So if I go into Maximo, you'll actually notice that I'm able to hold my mouse over any of these portlets, and I get this Edit Portlet button, and I'm actually able to, perhaps for this Favored Applications portlet that shows me securities and users and so forth, I can click this pencil and open up the dialog that allows me to perhaps add more applications to this specific portlet. The reason that I'm able to do this and add, you'll see action tracking here, that I'm actually able to add new applications to these portlets is because of my security profile as Max Admin. If I navigate to the Security Groups application, you will actually notice, and let me go to the Max Admin group, and under Applications, there is a set of applications, and that's these applications here that I've listed out. So that's their Start Center, Favorite Application Setup, Inbox Assignment Setup, KPI Graph Setup, so forth. These control what a user can do in their Start Center if they are a member of a security group that grants them access to the functions in these applications. So let me demonstrate. If I go to the Max Admin group and I look at the Applications tab, and let me filter down to Start Center. These are the options that have been granted for this application, the Start Center application, to the Max Admin group. And as you can see, there are certain properties here. So the ability for me to modify my Start Center, so the button on the top right that you saw that allowed me to add new portlets, this has been granted to me by this option, the Read Modify Access to Start Center. Furthermore, this application grants me access to some of these buttons up at the top. So the Default Information button up here, which is found under my profile, default information, where a user can set up their own default insert site and so forth. That access to that dialog is granted through this application, as well as personal information, for example. If you wanted a user to be able to change their email perhaps or add phone numbers for their specific person record. When it comes to these other applications, the Favorite Application Setup, Inbox Assignments, KPI Graph, and so forth, if I show you here the Favorite Application Setup application, you'll see here that I've got the Read Modify Access checkbox checked. That means that for Favorite Applications portlets, I'm able to access that pencil button. I'm able to actually add applications to it. And then one important detail here is at the bottom. I think for those of you that administer users, the general consensus typically when you're setting up a security group is that the more checkboxes that you check, the more access you are granting a user, and typically, yes, that is the case. However, when it comes to the favorite applications and any of these other portlet applications, down here we've got a hide portlet signature option. And by granting this, so it's a little bit backwards, but by me granting the hide portlet signature option, this is actually going to hide any favorite applications from your Start Center. So this is, you actually grant the hiding as opposed to typically you're granting access, so just really be aware of that. And what you need to be aware of here is that actually by granting these hide portlets, you're essentially removing functionality from this security group. So just really be aware of that. The last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to Start Center security is that Start Center security is better said, what Start Centers you see are all based on the different security groups that you're a member of, and each security group actually has a Start Center template defined for it. So if you happen to be a user that is a member of multiple groups and each of those groups perhaps has its own Start Center template, you as an end user are going to see, I'm not going to save any changes, on your Start Center when you log on, multiple tabs because you have been granted all of those different Start Centers. So these are just some notes that you should be aware of. Now, when it comes to actually associating queries to Start Center, so maybe you're asking yourself, if you don't know how, well, how do I actually see data on my Start Center? And the way that this is done is by actually creating queries in Maximo, and then saved queries to be specific, and then you associate those saved queries to your Start Center. So the first thing that I'd want to do is create in the target app, the app that you want to obtain this data from, create that query, and then you associate it to that Start Center. So let me, for example, go to the user's application in this case, simulating, being somebody who's an administrator. As somebody who's an administrator, I might be interested in active users and what the different types are. Often organizations will use the type field to designate license usage. So for example, if you are an organization that's got a mix of authorized user licenses, limited user licenses, and perhaps express, and those are your three different types, you might be able to say that perhaps your authorized is type 1, limited is type 2, and express might be type 3, however you want to associate that. And that leads into now being able to track your license usage. So me as an administrator, I can search for all active users and see what types of licenses that they have. But instead of me always needing to log into into this application and make this specific search, this might be important enough to me that I actually want to see it on my Start Center all the time, every time that I log on. So if that's the case, I can actually save this specific query, and we're going to call this the active users in Maximo. We'll give the query a name. We'll give it a description. And in this case, we'll say that it's public so that other users can use this query. And now that I've got a saved query, what we can do in Maximo is that we can add a portlet, a result set portlet that displays that query. So, let me scroll up to the top, and if you recall, the way that we did that was by changing the content layout of my Start Center, keeping in mind that this is me as a user modifying my own Start Center. This isn't a template, but the same principle applies to a template. What I can do now is, let's say on the left-hand side, I would like to add a new portlet. We're going to make it a result set portlet. And we're going to call this the active users result set portlet, and by clicking finish, we now on the bottom have a new portlet which has yet to be set up. So let's set this up. And again, this is done by using the pencil icon that's granted via your security groups as we just demonstrated. And when I click this, now I see a result set setup window. And this is where now I have to tell Maximo, well, what's the application that the query that you just created is on. In this case, it's the user application. And then it asked me, well, what's the query that you would like to return? In this case, it was the active users in Maximo. If you recall, that's the query that we just saved in the system. And in the bottom under field configuration is where we would actually choose what are the fields that are based on that user application, the user object that you want to display on your Start Center. So in my case, the important fields, I believe, would have been the user, it would have been user, it would have been the status, and the type. So if we take a look at this and just do this filter, the following fields in Maximo meet this, they're either user status or type named. So I'm going to say that I want the status, the type, and the user ID. And we're going to now add these fields onto my selected field section so that I can see these fields when I log on to my Start Center. But I don't want to just do that. In my case, perhaps I actually want to add some personal information. So these would be fields that are actually associated to the person record of this user that is going to be displayed on my result set. So when I click on the person, now it might actually want to display their display name. And that is a new feature that is available in 7.6, and we're going to talk about actually modifying what's driving this, which is an object structure. So for now, let me just select this for you and click Finish and show you what this looks like. And this instance might require a little refresh. We'll go to refresh. I think I have some queries that haven't been optimized. So now if we look at our active users result set, we'll see the 4 columns that I selected. These are my the status, the type, the user, and so forth. However, we want to be able to talk about, perhaps we want to color code this, perhaps we want to chart this. So I'm going to show you a couple of nice, bonuses that I like to call them, that you can actually take advantage of. So in our case, for here, I'm going to click on the pencil icon again, and I'm going to show you what we can do with the color options is what we'll talk about first. So under the color options, I might, because type 1 users or type 2 or any types of these users might be something that is of relevance to me and I want it to pop out, what I can actually say is that if I see a type and that type happens to be equal to, and in this case we'll say type 2. Perhaps I might want to make it red. Type 2 users might be something that I want to pop out at me, so I'm going to add a color alert for that. So let's click on Finish, and of course these are all type 1, so let me scroll, see if we can find a type 2. We've got a type 3 there, so let's actually make our chart a type 1. As you can see, most of our users are type 1. And you'll see that all of now our results have turned red because these are all type 1 users. The query that we just told Maximo to execute evaluates to true, meaning the type is equal to type 1, thus the color is red. Another example of this might be for work orders. If you have work orders that are perhaps due in the next week or overdue, you might be able to color code those, for work orders that are overdue, color code them red. This is in an example where you might have work orders as a planner displayed on your screen. Except one thing that you need to be aware of is that when you're using these expressions, the expression value is just a constant. In this case, I can't put in, sys date or like a bind variable such as date in order to be able to calculate, is my date within, the next 7 days. Something like this isn't actually going to work. So if you wanted to do something more complex like this, to be able to color code work orders that are, overdue by 7 days or upcoming in 7 days or anything like that, you would actually need to set either an escalation in the background that looks at all work orders and detects any work orders that are due within 7 days, and then sets perhaps an attribute on that work order, and then you can drive the color off of that attribute. Is something that you'd have to do. Or if you wanted to do it, in real time, you would be able to do that using an automation script. So just be aware that in your expression values, you're actually defining something that's a constant. Now, the next thing that you can actually do with your result sets is you can set up chart options. So in our case, if I wanted to instead show, instead of just a list of users, I actually wanted to show a graph, in this case either a bar or perhaps a pie chart. In this case, let's just say that this is going to be a bar graph. We can now tell Maximo, what are you grouping by? And in this case, I can tell Maximo, well, why don't we group by type? And in our type, we can actually then set what is that legend going to be. So in our case, I'm going to say, this will become clear in just a second, I'm going to say that the legend for the attribute is user types, and then the legend for the value title is the number of users. So let's try that and see what that looks like. If you recall, we've got empty expression here. Let me remove the color. And now you'll see this has turned, the result set is actually now being displayed in a chart. Here's the legend that we actually defined, as well as what the results are when you group by these by these types of users. And at any point in time, you can click on these as a user, and it's actually going to take you to the application where you've saved this query and show you these users. So that's, that's another handy feature that you can take advantage of. The very last thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to Start Centers, or not Start Centers, but result sets rather, is that if you were wondering how it is that under the field configuration here, the related objects, how it is that we can add to this. For those of you guys that maybe are looking at this and you're wondering what this is for, in previous versions of Maximo, you could only display data for one object, and then the best way to describe that is if you created a result set for work orders, for example, you would only be able to display on your Start Center result set work order attributes. So things like scheduled start, scheduled finish, description. But when it comes to, if you wanted to add information for the related location, the location that's on the work order related asset, perhaps the description of the location, something along those lines, you didn't have the option of doing that previously, but now you do. And the way that this is done, which is more of an administrative task, but if there's any, of you type of listeners out on the call today, if you want to add more objects to the list of objects that you can add in your result sets, this is done using the object structures application. And what you need to do here is you actually need to find an object structure which is consumed by reporting. In this case, there's one called user details, and you might notice on here that there is a number of objects on here. There's actually more than what we saw, and I'm not going to get into in this webcast on how to configure object structures, but what I can tell you for now is that in order for a child object to show up, in this case being the person child object, in order for that to show up as being selectable on my result set, it needs to have a cardinality of single. And that actually allows you to select data from that. If you notice some of these other objects, they're one-to-many relationships, so we can't select these in our object structure. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of what we can do with result sets, and I'm going to just quickly shift over to KPIs. And for KPIs, KPIs are actually changed in the KPI Manager application, and we have two different types of KPIs. You'll see we've got percentage types and we've got decimal types. And when we click into some of these KPIs, you'll actually see that it's broken out into a select statement and a where clause. So in our case, if we wanted to look at, there is, this one's an easier one. So the number of current sessions, we would write a select statement, which in this case is select the number of sessions from the max session table. And the where clause is, we're going to exclude anything that's the system user, in this case being Maximo. So what you would do as an administrator, somebody who has access to this, is you can create these statements, which then can get even more complex. You can actually, if you can think of it, essentially you can write a where clause for this. But what you would do as an administrator is you can write these statements. I recommend that you actually write them in SQL Developer or a tool outside of Maximo to just prove that you can do this. And when you've now written your where clauses, you would select your targets, your caution at, and your alert values, meaning what are these color bands that you're going to define for your result set. One other thing that you can set on a KPI, which a lot of people might not be aware of, is that for a KPI, you can actually set linked KPIs. So let me see, in this case, let me pick this user session link KPI, as well as a report, if you actually want somebody to be able to run a report based on a KPI. So let me add a KPI and a report to this KPI. This is our type 1 users. And I don't know if for any of you guys that might have been paying attention, you might have actually noticed that there is on my result set a registered type 1 users KPI, and here's the related KPI and related report that now I can run right from my Start Center. So that's another handy feature that we've got access to in Maximo. When it comes to the last topic that I wanted to cover in this webcast, which is KPI templates, when it comes to that mechanism, what you just need to be aware of is that if you are somebody in an organization who perhaps has multiple sites, you might have ran into the challenge in any time that you want to group results for a KPI. So if you want to run the number of active work orders perhaps across all your different sites, and you wanted a KPI for each different site, if you got 5 different sites, you're going to have to create 5 different KPIs. So in Maximo, there's a feature which actually allows you to create one record, and it's called a KPI template. And that KPI template is where you would define a variable, in our case, perhaps sites, and then from within that single record, you can actually generate all of your KPIs. So let me actually walk you through an example of how you would do this. So this is done using the KPI templates app, and in my case, what I want to do is, if you recall, when we were looking at that KPI, at the KPI application, there was a number of KPIs that counted the number of users. There was a KPI that counted the type 1 users, type 2 users, all the way to type 10, which resulted in 10 different KPIs. So rather than creating 10 different KPIs from scratch, we have the ability to do this right from the KPI templates. So we can do this by saying, let's call this the user types template. It's auto-numbered for me. We're going to fill in the application that this is done. We're going to say that this is decimal, meaning it's just a count rather than a percentage. And in this case, we want to say we want to produce a count. So in our case, it's the count of user ID from max user where type equals type 1. However, there's one bit, actually in this case, you know what, let me try different. Let me just go with I think percentage might be a better example for you here. So let's actually bring up the percentage of users of a certain type amongst all types. So in our case, let's say that we're going to go, rather than hard coding in the type, we would like to say where type is equal to a variable, in our case, called type. And if we want to actually have this be a percentage, we are going to say select count user ID from max user So what I'm actually doing here is I've created a query that specifies a variable, and this variable then I'm going to have to tell Maximo the different types of KPIs that I want to create based on this variable. So let me save this and make sure that validation is correct. And I'm going to say that I would like to calculate type, in our case, let's say users. For the object, if you recall, we're using the user table, and the attribute is going to be type. This is going to be the single variable that I'm going to create. And under KPIs now, I'm going to create a KPI for each of the different types that I have in the system. So let me say that for our first KPI, the type is going to be type 1. And for the type 1 KPI, now we can set any of our targets. So our target for the percentage of type 1 might be 90%. And we might caution at 95% and alert at 99%. And let's add another type here, which is going to be of type 2. And type 2 users, we might only want to have type 2 users be 10% of our users, and we might want to caution at 15% and at 20%. And lastly, let's create a KPI for type 3 users, and we might want to caution or target 5%, caution at 10%, and alert at 15%. Now, the last thing that we would need to do in our case, what I've just done is I've set up a KPI template with 3 KPIs that are going to be generated on it and the different target, caution at, and alert at attributes. And what I can now do is I can actually generate my KPIs for this KPI template, and that generates the KPIs in the background, which allows me to actually view these. Under my KPI manager. And here's our 3 KPIs. You notice in our case, 95% of our users are actually type 1, so I'm a little bit over, whereas type 2 users are actually more than our value here, so we are way over on those. And we're way over on our type 3s.